Americans need to learn to live more like Europeans. Supply chain shortages, Bloomberg's Alison Schrager says, are constraining US consumers' endless appetite for buying whatever they want and whenever we want. It's about time. Um, it's not a it's not a very good article, and it's not a very good proposition, I would contend. Uh, in the first place, just from the off, do they imagine that Europe is not suffering from supply chain shortages? Because I'm pretty sure we've just gone through months and months and months of every front page newspaper headline telling us how Brexit is causing supply chain problems in Australia. Um,
Yes, well, if they think that, then they really haven't been following European news. But I suspect, and well, I don't need to suspect, I can already see that this is a chiefly economic article. So it's basically saying that Americans should live like Europeans because social democracy.
I'm not
Um,
sure that it is. I mean, I think it's a moral argument because it's beginning with a moral premise, which is, as it says here, we've entered an age of overabundance. And the implication, which I'm sure is expounded upon later in the article, is that overabundance is a bad thing. But actually, if you scan what's being said here, what the problem this author has is wealth and signs of wealth. So consumption per capita is growing 65% from 1990 to 2015. It's only 35% growth in Europe. So Americans are richer and they're consuming more because their economy is better than in
but
Europe, is
I
what
don't
she's
know
saying.
what does this person mean by overabundance? What does that
Americans
mean?
are buying too much stuff. They're too consumerist.
Okay, well,
Their
that
homes are too big, as we see here. The big
but
changes in American lifestyle. The average US home was 1,700 square feet in 1980. In 2015, it's 2,000 square feet. So people having more living space is apparently a bad thing. It's an immoral thing. We should definitely look to Europe for that, where we all live in hovels. Um,
but is this
15% of
okay? So
households only don't have a TV. Only 3% don't. So more Americans can afford to have TVs.
is this
That's
a
obviously a
moral
bad thing.
argument?
Yes.
One might even say a theological argument, or is it just the argument that states in Europe interfere more in the economies and therefore less capitalism? I mean, what's going on here? Because
Yeah. I mean, that's where it leads to, but because everything that's being described here in normal conventional parlance is good, because this all this is testament to is that Americans have more consumer power than they once had. They have more access to luxury items than they once had. Luxury items, items that were once luxury items, no longer are. TVs, for instance, it says here 15% didn't have a TV in 1980. Now only 3% don't. In this country, in the 1980s, you had to rent your TV. You couldn't afford one. American cars in the 1970s had electric windows that weren't introduced. And I'm going on my own knowledge here, not the article. But electric windows weren't introduced in cars in this country until about the 1990s.
but I'll
And
stop. I'll stop you there though, because this is where I already know that I'm going to disagree with. Well, not necessarily disagree with the article, but come at it from a different perspective, which is that economic arguments like, oh, this nation can afford more TVs than this one, that they often take place at a weird sort of disconnect with any other consideration. Uh, So, for example, I am no fan of television. Um, I watch it occasionally. I'm not connected to, I don't know how you call it, satellite television. I have no channels on my television. Like most people of my generation, I have access to sort of Netflix and things like this. Um, there are some shows that I enjoy. On a broader level, though, I fully accept the sort of dire effects that television as a form of media has had on culture or might be said to have on culture. So I can go along with the argument that things like television is bad. For example, the T.S. Eliot line when television was first becoming really prominent, he wrote to the Times and said that we need to be careful here because this is going to have profound consequences on culture, on people's minds, and he was right about that. Um, so I can understand all of that, but the economic arguments about which country can afford more of this, that, and the other often take place at a distant disconnect from those kinds of considerations, as if the two were. They talk about them as if the two were related, and I disagree with that.
yeah, but I mean, they're also incredibly selective in the things that they choose to cite because what this article is actually conveying is a kind of it's a moral message, and it's a very snooty upper class metropolitan moral message judging the consumer habits of people of lower incomes than themselves, and they
Yes.
pick out what they consider to be luxury items. all of which demonstrates that the US consumer has far greater consumer power and far greater capacity for spending on far greater amounts of goods than any other country in the world, including any other country in Europe does. But if you can infer from that other things, which is that that level of economic growth, that amount of disposable income, means that they are able to feed themselves, for instance, heat their homes, have running water, at a cost which is so cheap they can spend even more money on things they want as opposed to things they just need. And we don't hear about that when it comes to articles like this because it's all about moral judgments of consumer choices. And it's just incredibly rubbish. It's also very cute when Americans try to comment on Europe because every time they do, almost without fail, they reveal they don't have a clue what they're talking about. So it says here that European levels of consumption coexist with lower levels of growth. That is true. It feels like our voracious consumption is what fuels the economy. That is also true. It doesn't just feel that way, it is. But it needn't be the case. Long term sustainable growth doesn't come from going deep into debt to buy stuff we don't really need. It comes from technology and innovation, where we come up with new products and better ways of doing things. Well, yeah, that's what's already happened. That's why you can buy TVs, you dolt. That's literally what happens. And also, to point to Europe as an example of sustainable growth, anyone who's taken a look at the European Central Bank recently, or the Italian debt mountain, which could, if one significant Italian bank goes under, the eurozone is basically screwed, and it will be worse than 2008. And there are real significant issues with this because the European Central Bank and the Deutsche Bank in Germany, which is also in trouble with federal regulators in the United States for its lending practices, have lent so much money to the Italians, who are in so much debt, similar to the Greeks, but much worse because of the place of Italy as one of the larger economies in the eurozone, means that one significant bad episode will bring the whole thing crashing down. Now, the United States has gone through unprecedented supply chain shortages, not as a result of its hyper-consumerism, but because of unprecedented government decisions to restrict the very free market, which has given them access to all of these greater consumer products much, much more cheaply. You will learn entirely the wrong lessons if you say, therefore, that should become the norm in the name of sustainability, when in fact, the lesson from the United States is that growth is perfectly sustainable, which is why it's consistently grown year after year, decade after decade, almost since, well, certainly since the Civil War, and has become the richest country in the history of the world. There is no necessary law which determines that has to stop. The only thing that can stop it is people who believe, like this person does, that they should have essentially the right to control what other people buy, which is effectively what these kinds of articles advocate. But I thought in the little time we had left, unless you have any comments on that, we could explore the ways in which, because we might disagree on this, whether it is more broadly than in economics, whether it is desirable for Americans to emulate the Europeans in any respect at all. Because I would have to confess I'm struggling to name one.
Well, in many ways, it's a tough question because America is so different from Europe and was conceived. There's not a country in Europe that wasn't born organically over thousands of years of very complicated history, the interplay between war, ecclesiastical power, uh, start, princelings. It's so complex. And it's also organic. America can't have what Europe has, and it can't be Europe, no matter how much it wants to do. A good sort of microcosm of this is the sort of phenomenon rather of a certain breed of Catholic in America who or which idolizes C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and the Inklings. This might be slightly recherche to some of our viewers and to you, but I am a huge fan of the Inklings. But yeah, they there are certain people, there are certain Catholics in America who, and again, this is just an example in small, writ small, of this phenomenon, whereby certain Americans will try to emulate the Inklings. So they believe genuinely that they can relive and revivify a certain very specific 1920s to 30s milieu in which uh, collared, starched, tweed-wearing, beer-drinking Englishmen meet in an English pub in Oxford and talk about, Norse mythology and so on and so forth. Americans are really good at this. They are voracious. They don't really have a culture of their own. That they're what they do is they take bits and bobs of other cultures. It's the perfect eclectic nation. They take other bits and bobs of other cultures and they mesh them all into their own uh, into their own image. The same thing can be said with American religion. I mean, Christianity in America is is so divorced from the vast mainstream of Christianity throughout the whole rest of the world for 2,000 years. I mean, they've really created their own religion in this. Um, so this is the American way. This is what they do. To say that they could live, they could learn to live more like Europeans. It verges on the oxymoronic. It is, or the contradictory, or at least the paradoxical. It can't happen. However, unlike the writer of this article, I think that if Americans were to try to emulate the Europeans in some way, it would be, well, not in the realm of economics, because it would be counter to the American way of doing things. It would be, I don't know what it would be. I think I've already made my point. I'm rambling now. It's just too different. America was created. America is a creation. It's radical. It has a constitution forged by radicals in Philadelphia. It is a radical proposition. It still is. There are conservative elements within it and always have been. But to say that it could be like Europe or that Americans could learn to live more like Europeans, I mean, has anyone ever witnessed an American visiting Europe? An American could never, you've got certain. I know certain Americans who have come to Europe or to England specifically and have really become honorary members and who are in because they're outsiders in a way are actually more attuned to certain facets of our character than we are. But no, it's preposterous. Americans are Americans, and they could not live like Europeans if they wanted to.
No,
We have
well,
to
they
forget.
should bloody well stay that way, and they shouldn't want to either. I mean, that was the sort of the other point I think which I was getting, which is that and going back to the historical creation of the state that you mentioned, Americans had to leave Europe to get what they have today. They had to leave the rigidness, the ossified nature of European society, and its overdevelopment and the concentration of too much power in unaccountable bodies, and the inability to actually make a life for yourself, where states have become too big, and governments have become too big, and taxes have become too high, and the economies are growing too slowly, and they had to leave this stultifying atmosphere to make a life for themselves, to find the kind of freedom which would allow their innovation and their own efforts and the Protestant ethic to thrive and to flourish. They had to leave to get what they've got today. And what they've got today is unparalleled in the history of the human species. It is the richest country by, it's not, you can't even quantify it. It's such a big order of magnitude. The richest country in the history of the world, where the middle class live as the upper class in every other country in the world, or at least the upper class. Where in America, on a median income, you can live in a house with a swimming pool, which is 2,000 square feet. Where if you're still in the right places in the United States, you can build a house, roughly speaking, as you like it, where you like it, in the manner that you want to. You can found a business much more easily. You can make money much more easily. And no matter where you're born in your station in life, you can, at least theoretically, and more in practice than in any other country in the world, you can get to the top. That was always its founding promise. That was the promise of the American dream. And to the extent it still exists, it's only because America hasn't started emulating Europe. And to the extent it no longer exists, it's because they already have started emulating Europe. And this is why you see such huge problems in the most Europeanized states in the Union, like New York, for instance, or California, which is full of the kind of person who writes for Bloomberg articles saying articles like this. Um, this is what pulls America down. America is exceptional. American exceptionalism is probably the only exceptionalism in the world today which is justified and justifiable. Why would you want to take the best economy in the world and realign it along the model of some of the worst and most dysfunctional economies in the world? Why would you want to take a healthcare system which has huge numbers of problems and flaws? I'm not going to deny that, but has a far better survival rating, for instance, than most European healthcare systems. It has far more. It produces more of the research. It produces more of the drugs than any other health system in the world. You can learn some things in America, definitely, from Switzerland, not notably traditionally European in the European Union sense. You can learn from Singapore, which is not European at all. Um, if you want to. But the one thing you don't want to do is bring in the NHS, which is what most of Americans think of as European healthcare, because it's an awful system. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to give them all the most dynamic economies that creates more jobs than any other country in the world, which, even under Joe Biden has job growth figures which European countries could only dream of? Why would you want to make it more like a European country in that sense? And why would you want to sacrifice the huge consumer power you have in the United States for a continent which lags behind you in the order of decades in terms of what's available to buy, at what prices, at what choice you have? Well, why would you want this? Why would anybody in America look to Europe and say, yes, more of that?